The laughter around the table shimmered like crystal sharp and brittle, cutting through the carols that played softly in the background. "Tonight," my father said, raising his glass, "we have the privilege of dining with our family's philanthropist." His voice was heavy with mockery. "The one who gave up the business world to chase her little projects. Don't worry, sweetheart. We'll make sure you can afford dessert." The room erupted in laughter. My mother's pearls glinted as she smiled. My brother clinked his glass against his fiancée's, and even the servants tried to hide their smirks. I sat perfectly still, the smile on my lips polite, measured, and false. The scent of roasted duck and cinnamon hung thick in the air, but the taste in my mouth was ash. I was back in the Harrington mansion after 6 long years, and it felt less like home and more like an exhibit one, where I was the artifact they all pitied. "Come now, Elena," my mother said, touching her napkin to her lips. "We're just teasing. You know how your father is." I did. He'd spent his life turning mockery into a language of love. I'd learned to understand it, to endure it, and eventually to stop needing it. But tonight I let him believe I hadn't changed. That was part of the plan. Outside the tall windows, Lakewood shimmered beneath a thin layer of ice. Snow fell steadily, wrapping the world in white silence, while the inside of the mansion burned with golden light and empty pride. My father, Arthur Harrington, sat at the head of the table like a king out of seasoned silver hair, neatly combed, his cufflinks engraved with the family crest. He was still the man who believed control was power and wealth was proof of worth. My mother, Margaret, floated beside him in a silk gown, the color of wine, smiling, as though every guest in the room were a mirror, reflecting her success. My brother Caleb, his tie perfectly straight, leaned back with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. And Sophie, his fiancée, watched me with the kind of curiosity reserved for something both pitiable and entertaining. So Sophie said brightly, swirling her wine, "What do you do these days, Elena?" "Still working on that little freelance thing." Her tone was sweet and venomous, the way only practiced cruelty can be. I met her gaze, smiled faintly, and said nothing. My father chuckled. "She's between ventures, dear. Not everyone's meant to manage real assets." More laughter, Caleb added. "Maybe she's writing a book, something about learning to live on less." The laughter swelled again, echoing against the marble and glass. It was all performance rehearsed, ritualized, and viciously predictable. "Some people mistake obedience for success," I said softly. The laughter thinned. My father looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And some people," he said, "mistake rebellion for wisdom." His tone was light, but I heard the edge beneath it. We'd played this game before years ago, and back then I had always lost. Not tonight. I reached for my wine, swirling the dark liquid, and smiled as if conceding. "You might be right," I said, my voice even. But then again, I learned from the best. Margaret sighed, a carefully measured exhale that signaled her discomfort. "Let's not make this a debate, darling. It's Christmas." Caleb leaned forward, smirking. "Come on, Mom. A little debate keeps things lively. Maybe Elena can explain how her ventures are going." His smirk widened when I didn't answer. "You're still in that tiny apartment in New York, right?" I nodded once. "Still," I said quietly, "and still paying for it myself." My father laughed. "A true accomplishment these days, survival without achievement." He raised his glass again. "To family success. To those who carry the name proudly." I lifted mine slowly. "To lessons learned," I said. His eyes flickered, uncertain if I meant defiance or surrender. He chose to laugh again, but the sound was brittle. The table gleamed with silver and gold, the candles reflecting off every polished surface. It was a portrait of perfection, the kind. My mother loved everything immaculate, everyone pretending. Yet beneath the surface, the air trembled with judgment. They'd all agreed years ago that I was the family failure, the one who'd embarrassed my father, the one who couldn't handle the family business. I used to believe them. I'd let their words crawl under my skin until I couldn't recognize myself anymore. But that girl had died the day they cast me out. I glanced across the table, meeting Mrs. Porter's eyes. She had been our housekeeper since I was a child, now older, slower, but with the same quiet strength. As she set down a platter of duck, her hand brushed my shoulder, a tiny gesture of kindness no one else noticed. "Good to see you again, Miss Elena," she whispered. I smiled at her. "It's good to be back." Her eyes softened as she nodded, understanding more than anyone else in the room. Sophie poured herself more wine. "You must miss the company sometimes," she said. "Harrington Group has grown so much since you left." "Caleb just closed a deal with the governor's office." Caleb grinned. "Well, someone had to keep the family name afloat." "Yes," I said calmly, "and you've done a marvelous job keeping it in the headlines." His smirk faltered. He knew I was referring to the recent scandal rumors of insider trading that the press hadn't quite buried. My father shot me a warning look. "Don't bring business into dinner," he said. "Of course," I replied. "Wouldn't want to spoil the mood." Silence hung for a beat, then my mother clapped her hands softly. "Dessert will be served soon. Let's not forget it's a celebration." I wondered what exactly we were celebrating, their success, my failure, or the illusion that nothing had changed. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, its sound deep and resonant. The snow outside thickened, pressing against the windows like an audience waiting for the next act. As I watched the snow fall, I thought about the years I'd spent clawing my way back from the edge, about the late nights, the closed doors, the quiet rejections. I thought about the first client who'd trusted me, the first investor who'd believed in what I built. And I thought about the phone resting beside my plate, its screen dark for now, but waiting. Somewhere in that silence, I felt my pulse steady. Let them laugh, I thought. Let them believe I'm still small. Power isn't who laughs the loudest, it's who waits the longest. My father leaned toward me again as if he couldn't help himself. "You know, Elena," he said, "your mother and I worry about you. It must be hard living in that little apartment after growing up here." "No driver, no staff, no control," I interrupted softly. He froze glass halfway to his lips. "Freedom suits me better." He set the glass down, his knuckles white. "Freedom," he repeated like it was an insult. "That's what people say when they can't afford comfort." Maybe, I said, meeting his eyes. Or maybe it's what people say when they finally can. Mrs. Porter cleared her throat gently. "Pardon me, sir. Dessert is ready." My father nodded stiffly, still holding my gaze. I turned toward the window again. Outside, the lake was a sheet of frozen silver beneath the falling snow. For a fleeting moment, I saw my reflection in the glass, calm, composed, unrecognizable from the woman they used to mock. The fire crackled behind me, laughter rose again, but it all felt far away, like a noise I'd already outgrown. Then faintly from the clutch resting beside my plate, I felt it, a vibration soft but insistent. I glanced down. The screen lit up, and for a heartbeat my breath caught. The name glowing on the display read Sterling Private Bank. I touched the phone lightly, letting it buzz once more before pressing it silent. "Just in time," I whispered. Mrs. Porter looked up from across the room, her expression puzzled. I gave her the smallest nod. My father raised his glass one final time. "To the Harringtons," he declared, his voice booming. "To wealth, power, and legacy." Glasses clinked. Smiles glittered. I lifted my glass, meeting his eyes, and said quietly, "To surprises." He frowned, unsure what I meant. The clock struck again, echoing through the hall. The phone in my clutch blinked once more, as if reminding me that the world was about to shift. I smiled to myself and took a slow sip of wine. The snow outside kept falling, silent and endless, as if the universe itself was holding its breath for what came next. The glass walls made everything look cleaner than it was, cold light reflecting off steel, silence stretching like judgment. I stood at the far end of the long table with a folder clutched to my chest, trying to steady my hands. It was supposed to be my quarterly presentation, but it felt more like a trial. My father sat at the head of the table, his posture immaculate, eyes scanning the papers in front of him. Around him, 6 board members, men, in suits old enough to be my uncles, shifted uncomfortably. My brother Caleb lounged at the other end, pretending to review his phone. He didn't need to speak. His smirk did it for him. "This report is embarrassing," my father said, finally, his voice crisp as breaking glass. "Over budget, behind schedule, inconsistent data. Do you even understand how this reflects on our name?" He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. The weight of the room already had me pinned. I opened my mouth. "Dad, the supplier delayed." He raised a hand. "Excuses don't pay dividends, Elena." His tone was so casual it hurt more than shouting. "We don't operate on emotion here. We operate on results." A soft chuckle rose from the end of the table, one of his allies trying to win points. My throat went dry. "I filed the new proposal 2 weeks ago," I said quietly. "It included adjustments to—" "I don't want adjustments." His gaze lifted at last, sharp and glacial. "I want performance." Every word hit like a verdict. Behind him, the city glittered through the glass wall, New York at its most merciless. I glanced at Caleb, hoping for support, but he only met my eyes and gave a small, satisfied smile. "This company doesn't reward mediocrity," my father continued. "Not even within the family. You'll step down as project manager immediately. HR will handle your transition paperwork." For a moment, I thought I hadn't heard right. My heart stuttered. "You're firing me." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "You'll thank me one day. Failure builds character, assuming you can afford to keep learning." Someone near the window stifled a laugh. I felt the sting of tears pressing behind my eyes, but I refused to give him the satisfaction. "I worked for this," I said, barely above a whisper. "You told me if I proved myself, I told you to earn it," he cut in. "And you didn't." The silence after that felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried. One by one, the men stood gathering their papers, avoiding my eyes. The scrape of chairs on marble was the only sound. Caleb lingered, last sliding his phone into his pocket. "It's not personal," he said softly, though the gleam in his eyes betrayed the lie. "Dad just expects perfection." "Perfection or obedience?" I asked. He smiled thinly. "Same thing here." I stood there alone as they filed out, the sound of their footsteps fading into the corridor. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, small, pale, humiliated. I forced my breathing to slow. If I cried, he'd win again. When I finally left the room, the receptionist looked up, startled. She couldn't have been more than 22, nervous in her new role. "Mr. Harrington said to collect your badge," she murmured. I handed it over without a word. She hesitated. "He said to wish you luck." "Luck," I said softly. "That's for people without leverage." Outside, the winter air hit me like punishment. The sky was a slate gray, clouds thick with snow. I stood on the sidewalk staring up at the skyscraper that still bore my family's name in silver letters. For years, that building had been my world. Late nights, endless reports, a desperate hope that one day he'd look at me and see more than a mistake. Now I was just another employee exiting quietly. As I walked away, snow began to fall, light and slow, covering the city in indifferent white. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost ignored it, but the screen lit up with a name that still made my stomach twist. Mom. Her voice was clipped, practiced. "Elena, your father tells me you're taking a break from the company." "I didn't take it," I said. "He forced it." "Don't exaggerate," she sighed. "People will talk. We'll say you're focusing on personal projects." "I'm not ashamed, Mother." "Well," she said after a pause, "we are." And the line went dead. I stood there for a long time, phone still pressed to my ear, letting the wind numb my face. I didn't cry. The tears would come later when no one could see. That night, I packed the few things from my office into a single suitcase and rented a studio apartment on the east side. It was the size of my old walk-in closet with a leaky radiator and peeling paint. But when I closed the door, the silence felt clean. I sat on the floor eating takeout noodles from a paper box, staring at the single lamp flickering in the corner. For the first time, I wasn't surrounded by his voice. I thought I'd feel free. Instead, I felt invisible. Days blurred into weeks. I sent out resumes, waited for replies that never came. Every rejection email ended the same way: we've decided to move forward with candidates who have stronger references. Stronger meant approved by my father. My savings shrank. I took temp jobs, answering phones, filing papers, whatever paid enough for rent. People whispered when they learned my name. "You're that Harrington," they'd ask, eyes wide. What happened? I stopped correcting them. One night, I passed the Harrington Tower again, its windows blazing gold against the dark sky. I watched the top floors where the boardrooms were, imagining my father still there. Caleb beside him, both certain I was finished. My reflection stared back from the glass, older somehow. I whispered to her, "Don't let them be right." The next morning, a thin envelope arrived at my apartment, an official notice severing my stock options and benefits. The letter was signed by my brother. I laughed, a sound brittle and sharp. So that was it, they'd erased me completely. That same evening I went back to Lakewood to retrieve the last of my things. My mother was waiting in the sitting room, a glass of wine in hand. "You look exhausted," she said. "Maybe this is a sign. You could use some time to reflect." I stared at her. He fired me in front of the entire board. She waved a hand. "It's business, darling. Nothing personal." That's easy to say when you're not the one humiliated. Her expression hardened. "Don't be dramatic. Your father knows what's best for the company. You embarrassed him." "By trying, by failing," she snapped. Then she softened her tone again. "You're young. Take time off, find something small to do. Charity work, perhaps. You've always been good with people." Her words stung worse than anger. She didn't mean to be cruel, she simply didn't know how to be kind. Caleb entered, loosening his tie. "Mom's right, Ellie. Maybe a break's what you need. Figure out what you're good at." I looked at him, my voice calm. "I already know what I'm good at. You just never gave me the chance." Before either could respond, my father appeared in the doorway. His presence filled the room like thunder. "Enough," he said. "You're an adult, Elena. Learn to fail with dignity." I rose slowly. "You taught me that control was love. You were wrong." His jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. I walked past him, suitcase in hand. Behind me, I heard him say, "Let her go. She'll be back when she learns her place." I didn't turn around. Outside, snow drifted in thick waves under the lamplight. My cab hadn't come yet, so I sat on the bench by the gate, the cold seeping through my coat. For a while I just breathed, watching my breath fog in the air. That was the night I stopped being a Harrington. Not because they disowned me, but because I chose to leave behind the part of me that needed them. I thought of everything I'd lost: the office, the title, the illusion of family. Then I thought of what I still had: time, Will, and a mind they'd never believed in. The gate light flickered. My cab pulled up. I looked back once at the mansion, warm light glowing in the windows, silhouettes moving inside. "They think I'll crawl back," I whispered. "They don't know I'm learning to walk." As the car pulled away, the house disappeared behind the curtain of snow. Somewhere in the darkness, a new voice formed inside me, quiet but steady. Power isn't inherited, it's built. By the time I reached the city, dawn was breaking pale and gray over the skyline. The streets were empty, the world silent. I unlocked the door to my apartment, dropped my bag, and stood by the window watching the snow melt on the glass. Tomorrow, I told myself, I'll start again. And for the first time, the thought didn't feel impossible. The job posting was for a temporary receptionist at a mid-size investment firm on Madison Avenue. The pay was modest, the hours long, and the tone of the ad was almost apologetic. But I took it. Pride had already cost me enough. The following Monday, I showed up in a gray wool coat and worn leather shoes, carrying a single notebook and the kind of determination that comes from having nothing left to lose. The office of Whitaker and Bell was a far cry from the marble corridors of Harrington Group. The carpet was faded, the desks cluttered with paperwork and coffee stains, the elevator doors squeaked when they closed. And yet it felt oddly human, messy, imperfect, alive. My supervisor, a kind, middle-aged woman named Carol, smiled when she greeted me. "Phones ring non-stop. Clients are impatient. You'll do fine." It was the first time in months someone had spoken to me like I was capable. By the end of my first week, I'd memorized every extension, every client name, and every habit of the partners who barely noticed me. One always left his coffee untouched. Another corrected people for saying stocks instead of equities. They saw me as background noise, which suited me perfectly. After years of scrutiny, invisibility was freedom. Every evening after the phones went quiet, I stayed late filing documents, reading reports I wasn't supposed to. It wasn't rebellion, it was education. I wanted to understand the system that had cast me out, and little by little it began to make sense. Numbers didn't care about last names. Money respected only intelligence and timing. One afternoon, a young man stormed out of the partner's office, his face flushed with frustration. He was tall, mid-20s, with the look of someone too bright to play by old rules. He nearly collided with my desk. "Sorry," he muttered. "No problem," I said, offering a polite smile. "Rough meeting," he gave a short laugh. "They don't see it. None of them do. I'm trying to build the future, and they're still talking about quarterly margins." He shook his head. "I'm Alex." "Elena," I replied. "Receptionist by title, listener by default." That made him grin. "Then you're already the smartest person in this building." He sat down across from me, uninvited, but unbothered, and launched into an animated explanation about his project, a digital platform for decentralized investments. Half of what he said went over my head, but the passion in his voice reminded me of something I'd buried long ago: belief. "The financial world is rigged," he said. "Same people, same families, same rules. I want to change that." I smiled faintly. "You're not wrong, but they'll never hand you permission." "Then I'll take it," he said simply. He left a business card on my desk before he walked away. A week later, he called and asked if I wanted to meet for coffee. I almost said no, but something in his tone, earnest, defiant, made me say yes. We met in a small cafe downtown. He had a laptop full of sketches, code, and projections. "I need someone who understands structure," he said. "I'm a builder, not a strategist. You seem like both." "I'm just a receptionist," I said. He looked at me as if I'd told him the sky was green. "Not with the way you ask questions." That was how it began. Two people sitting in a noisy cafe planning something that didn't yet have a name. We worked at night after our day jobs, drafting business plans, creating mock portfolios, pitching investors who thought we were delusional. Most turned us down. A few listened. One took a chance. We called it Solstice Capital. The name came to me one evening while watching the city lights flicker against the winter sky. "The longest night," I told him, "followed by light." Alex nodded. "Then let's make it shine." The first year was brutal. We worked out of a subleased space above a laundromat in Brooklyn. The radiator hissed, the Wi-Fi barely worked, and the paint peeled from the walls. But we had laptops, caffeine, and conviction. I handled logistics strategy and investor relations. Alex built the tech. We took turns sleeping on the couch, eating takeout, and pretending exhaustion was progress. When our first fund launched, it failed spectacularly. The numbers bled red. I stared at the spreadsheet for hours, wondering if my father was somewhere laughing. Alex put a hand on my shoulder. "Every failure is data," he said. "We learn, we pivot." So we did. We refined the model, rebuilt the pitch, reached out again. By the end of year 2, one investor became 5, 5 became 20. The growth was slow but steady, the kind that comes from discipline, not luck. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove something to anyone. I was building something for myself. Late one night, as we finalized the year-end reports, Alex looked up from his laptop. "You never told me why you started doing this." I hesitated. "Because once someone told me I wasn't enough, I believed him for too long." He nodded thoughtfully. "Whoever he was, he's wrong now." By the third year, Solstice Capital was managing hundreds of millions. Forbes ran a small feature calling us an underdog disruptor shaking Wall Street's foundations. I clipped the article and tucked it into a drawer, not to show anyone, but to remind myself how far I'd come. One morning, I opened my inbox to find an email from Sterling Private Bank. Your portfolio has reached premium client status. We'll assign you a dedicated wealth advisor. I stared at the words for a long time. The irony was delicious. The same financial circles that once whispered about my downfall now wanted my attention. That night, Alex brought a bottle of cheap champagne to the office. We sat on the floor laughing, exhausted, surrounded by cables and empty pizza boxes. To the broken ones, he said, raising his glass. Because we build better. I clinked his glass. To the underestimated. We drank, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel the triumph, not loud or dramatic, but quiet, earned. Still, there were nights when I woke up at 3 a.m., heart pounding, the echo of my father's voice in my head. Control is everything. Maybe he was right in his way, but he'd never understood that control didn't mean domination, it meant direction. And this time I was steering my own life. Months passed and success became routine. Investors called us visionaries. Clients sent gifts. The office moved into a sleek downtown tower with a view of the Hudson. We hired a team, built departments, expanded overseas. I still answered some emails. Myself, old habits die hard. But the receptionist's desk was now just a memory. One evening I found myself standing by the window of our new office, looking out at the skyline. Below me the city pulsed with light and motion. I thought of the girl who'd walked out of her father's building with nothing but humiliation. And I whispered, "You made it." But beneath the pride there was something else, a restlessness I couldn't name. Success hadn't erased the old wounds, it had just buried them under marble and glass. Every time I saw a Harrington Group headline, I felt a flicker of old fire. Then one day it came back into my world, in a way I hadn't expected. I was reviewing quarterly reports when Clara, my assistant, stepped in with an envelope. "This came by courier," she said. "No return address, but the seal looks expensive." I frowned and opened it. Inside was a single cream-colored card embossed in gold. "Family Christmas Eve dinner, Lakewood Estate. We'd love for you to join us." My mother's handwriting looped across the bottom, formal, elegant, practiced. "Father and I are eager to see you." I stared at the words until they blurred. 5 years. No calls, no messages, not even a birthday card. Now suddenly they were eager. The envelope smelled faintly of pine and control. I laughed quietly to myself. Not because it was funny, but because it was inevitable. The empire that once banished me was calling me home. And for the first time I realized something my father never would. Sometimes silence is the loudest answer. I folded the card, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed it on my desk. Whatever they wanted, they'd get their answer soon enough. The letter sat on my desk for 3 days, half buried under reports and contracts. Every time I glanced at it, I felt a dull pull in my chest, a mix of curiosity and dread. It wasn't just paper. It was the echo of everything I'd left behind. The gold seal glimmered faintly under the office light, and for a moment I thought about throwing it away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because no matter how far I'd come, part of me still wanted an ending. On the 4th morning I picked it up. The handwriting looked exactly as I remembered, graceful, distant, careful not to smudge. My mother's voice echoed in my head, "Appearances are everything, darling. Even your handwriting says who you are." I turned the envelope over in my hands, reading the same line again and again. "Family Christmas Eve dinner, Lakewood Estate. We'd love for you to join us." The words felt rehearsed, like an invitation to a performance rather than a reunion. Alex noticed me staring at it when he walked into my office. "You look like someone just handed you a live grenade," he said, dropping into the chair opposite my desk. "Close enough," I replied, holding up the envelope. He raised an eyebrow. Then I nodded. "Apparently, Christmas is the season for selective memory." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You're not actually considering going, are you?" I didn't answer right away. I could still picture my father's face that night, the contempt, the certainty that I'd never rise above failure. "Maybe," I said finally. "Maybe I need to see what's left of them." "Elena," his tone softened. "They don't deserve that kind of power over you anymore." "I know," I said quietly. But it's not for them, it's for me. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Then, promise me something. Don't go there to prove them wrong. Go there because you already know you were right. I smiled faintly. That's the only reason I'd walk back into that house. That night I didn't sleep much. The city below my penthouse was alive with holiday lights, the streets buzzing with people carrying gifts and laughter. I watched from the window, wondering how something as beautiful as Christmas could coexist with so much history and pain. I made coffee at 2 a.m. and sat at my kitchen counter, staring at the invitation. Maybe they wanted forgiveness. Or maybe they wanted something else, money, image, attention. Whatever it was, I'd find out soon. The next day, Clara found me in the office before sunrise, reviewing projections. "You're early," she said, surprised. "Don't tell me billionaires don't sleep." "Not this one," I said with a half smile. "Too much on my mind." She set a folder on my desk. The Sterling account confirmed the final transfer. Total assets now $920 million, excluding the pending Asian portfolio. I blinked, letting the number sink in. 920, I repeated. The figure looked unreal on paper. I had once been fired over a project that cost the company $2 million. Now I could buy it 10 times over. Clara hesitated, then asked, "Is it true you're flying to Vermont next week, Lakewood?" I said. "My family's estate." Her expression tightened. "You sure that's a good idea?" "I'm not sure of anything," I admitted. "But sometimes you have to walk through the fire to prove you can't be burned anymore." When she left, I sat in silence for a long time, staring out the window at the city that had built me. The skyline shimmered like a field of glass, cold and luminous. I thought about all the years I'd spent rebuilding myself piece by piece, about the girl who had eaten noodles alone on the floor of her apartment, and the woman who now negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching. I wasn't that broken girl anymore. I was the storm that came after. That evening, Alex came by my apartment with a bottle of wine. "If you're really going," he said, "you're going to need this." I poured 2 glasses, though I barely touched mine. "You ever wonder," I asked, "if forgiveness is just another kind of weakness?" He leaned against the counter. "No. I think forgiveness is strength. But only when you give it on your own terms." "What if I'm not ready for that?" "Then don't force it," he said simply. "Just walk in there with your head up and your heart locked. Let them talk. You already won." I laughed softly. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," he said. "But neither was this." He gestured around my apartment. "And you built it anyway." When he left, I packed my bags slowly. A simple black dress, a wool coat, a pair of gloves, nothing flashy. I didn't want to look rich. I wanted to look untouchable. The flight to Vermont was quiet, the sky outside painted in shades of silver and pale blue. I spent most of the time rereading the latest solstice reports, anything to distract myself from the weight in my chest. When the plane descended over the snow-covered hills, I caught my breath. Lakewood looked the same as it had in my childhood: endless white fields, frozen lakes, pine trees standing tall like sentinels. From above, it was beautiful. Up close, it had always felt suffocating. A driver was waiting with a black car at the airport. He wore the Harrington crest on his lapel, but I didn't recognize him. "Miss Harrington," he said, politely opening the door. His tone was professional, detached. I wondered if he knew who I was or what I'd become. The drive to the estate took nearly an hour. As we passed through the gates, I caught sight of the mansion, towering and pristine against the snow. The stone facade gleamed under strings of golden lights, every window glowing like it had something to hide. My stomach tightened. It was exactly as I remembered, perfect on the outside, hollow within. The car stopped in front of the grand staircase. I took a slow breath before stepping out. The air was sharp, the kind that cut clean through your lungs. The massive front doors opened before I could knock. Mrs. Porter stood there, the housekeeper who had practically raised me. Her hair had turned mostly gray, but her eyes were as kind as ever. "Miss Elena," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You came." I smiled for the first time that day. "I told you I would, didn't I?" She hugged me tightly, then pulled back to look at me. "You've changed," she said. "Stronger." So have you, I said. Still keeping them in line? She chuckled softly. Someone has to. Inside, the mansion glittered from floor to ceiling. Garlands of white roses draped across the banisters, candles flickered in crystal holders, and a towering Christmas tree sparkled in the center of the hall. It was breathtaking, and yet completely lifeless. Everything was too polished, too symmetrical, beauty arranged like a weapon. From the dining room, I heard laughter. My father's voice cut through it, all deep, commanding, familiar. If she even shows up, at least we'll have some entertainment, he was saying. The sound sent a chill through me, equal parts anger and adrenaline. Mrs. Porter glanced at me nervously. They're waiting, she said softly. Be kind, but not too kind. I smiled faintly. You always did know how to read me. I walked to the staircase and paused at the top, looking down at the scene below. My mother sat near the fireplace, draped in red silk, adjusting her diamond earrings. My father stood beside the tree, glass in hand, surrounded by guests. Caleb was at the table, his arm around Sophie, who was laughing too loudly. They all looked perfect, like a photograph from a magazine, like strangers I used to know. For a heartbeat, I considered turning around. I could still leave. Walk out, fly home, pretend this invitation had never arrived. But then my father's laughter rose again, sharp and familiar. It sounded exactly like it had 5 years ago when he'd told me I wasn't enough. So I exhaled, lifted my chin, and began walking down the stairs. The sound of my heels on the marble echoed through the hall, crisp and deliberate. Conversation faltered. Heads turned. My mother's smile froze halfway. My father's expression barely changed, just a flicker of surprise, quickly buried under arrogance. Elena, my mother said, standing. You made it. Of course, I said calmly. I wouldn't miss the performance. Caleb grinned. You're on time. That's new. Traffic was light, I replied smoothly, and I didn't want to miss the show. My father raised his glass. Then let's begin, he said. Try not to embarrass yourself this year. I smiled faintly. I'll do my best, Father. The tension settled around us like frost on the windows. As I took my seat across from them, I felt strangely calm. Let them laugh, I thought. Let them play their games. They still believed they were in control, but the truth was simple. This time I wasn't the one walking into their world. They were walking into mine. The dining room smelled of pine, roasted duck, and money. The table stretched nearly the entire length of the room, set with crystal silver and enough candlelight to make everything shimmer in soft gold. My mother had always been meticulous about presentation. Nothing in this house was ever left to chance, not the wine, not the lighting, and certainly not the illusion of perfection. Dinner is served, my father announced as if he were the host of some political gala. He gestured toward the long table where everyone was already seated, Caleb and Sophie to his right. A few family friends scattered among them, each one a mirror of the same self-importance I'd grown up around. I took the seat furthest from him near the end of the table, the same spot they had placed me in the last time I'd been here, when my worth had been measured in silence. The first course arrived. Lobster bisque delicately poured into porcelain bowls with the Harrington crest. I stirred mine slowly, watching the steam rise. My mother gave me a rehearsed smile from across the table. It's been far too long, darling. I was beginning to think New York had stolen you from us forever. Maybe it just borrowed me, I said softly. Caleb leaned back in his chair. You've been busy, haven't you? Word gets around. Word, I asked. He smirked. You've built some little firm, haven't you? Solstice something. Sophie leaned in, eyes bright. Oh yes, I saw a headline somewhere. Something about a disruptive new investment platform. Sounds exciting. It is, I said, matching her tone exactly. If you understand it. My father chuckled under his breath. Technology is a passing fad. Real wealth is intangible assets, land, legacy, things that last. And control, I murmured. He heard me. Yes, control. The thing you lost when you walked away from this family. I smiled faintly. Maybe I just learned how to hold it differently. The conversation paused. Only the sound of cutlery filled the air. Sophie decided to break the silence with her usual brand of casual cruelty. It must be so hard managing things on your own. I mean, without the structure you were used to. I glanced at her, still smiling. Hard isn't the same as impossible. You'd be surprised what you can build when no one's watching. She laughed, but it was too loud, too brittle. My mother gave her a polite look, warning her not to overstep, but the damage was already done. When the main course arrived, my father stood again to make a toast. He loved speeches, especially when they came at someone else's expense. To family, he said, raising his glass. To the legacy we've built together. To perseverance, and to the lessons learned from failure. Everyone echoed the words, to family. The sound of clinking crystal filled the room. I raised my glass last. To lessons learned, I said. Some of us take longer to learn, but we catch up eventually. His smile faltered for just a second. Then, as if to reclaim control, he said, So, Elena, tell us, are you still renting that apartment in the city, or have you finally bought something of your own? There it was, the jab disguised as curiosity. I'm comfortable where I am, I said. Comfortable, he repeated, savoring the word like wine. That's one way to put it. He turned to Sophie. You see, comfort is relative. Some people think having a paycheck is comfort. Others understand that true comfort comes from legacy. Sophie nodded eagerly like a student trying to impress a teacher. Exactly. Stability. That's what matters, Caleb laughed. Well, we can't all be CEOs, right? I leaned back, tilting my head slightly. No, but some of us can build them from scratch. He blinked, not sure how to respond. My mother stepped in, smiling tightly. Let's not make this about business, please. It's Christmas. Yes, I said. Let's not pretend it's about family either. The room went quiet. My father's voice hardened. Don't start this again. I didn't, I said softly. You did, 5 years ago. His eyes met mine, cold and sharp. You were unprepared. You made mistakes. I saved the company from your recklessness. And from me, I said. That's right, he snapped. You weren't ready. Ready for what? To obey? The question hung there, suspended between us. The same one that had ended my career, my place, my peace. My mother set her glass down gently. This isn't the time, Elena. No, I said, keeping my voice even. It's exactly the time. The fire crackled in the corner, filling the silence. My father's face was stone. You always confuse defiance for strength, he said. And you always confuse control for love. The words came out before I could stop them, and when they did, I realized I wasn't shaking anymore. I wasn't afraid of him. Not tonight. Sophie looked like she wanted to disappear. Caleb looked furious but said nothing. My mother stared at the tablecloth as if she could hide in its folds. Mrs. Porter entered quietly, refilling glasses. Her hand brushed my shoulder as she passed. It was a small gesture, but it steadied me. My father laughed suddenly, a short, bitter sound. Well, he said, it's comforting to know failure builds such confidence. I smiled back. And denial builds such fine dining. For a second even, he looked startled. Then he raised his glass again. To confidence, then. May it one day pay your bills. I raised mine in return. Don't worry, Father. It already does. He frowned. We'll see about that. We sat in tense silence for a few moments. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for me to crack, to cry, to beg like before. But I only took another sip of wine and said nothing. Outside, snow began to fall harder, pressing against the tall windows. The storm was coming, but inside, the real one was already here. Tell me, Caleb said finally, trying to lighten the mood. Do you ever miss it? The business, the pressure, what did you call it, discipline? I smiled. No, I don't miss being controlled. I learned something you haven't. And what's that? That freedom pays better, he scoffed. We'll see how long that lasts. My mother clapped her hands lightly, forcing a laugh. Enough about money, please. It's Christmas. Let's talk about something joyful. Sophie leaned toward me again, syrupy sweet. Oh, I have something joyful. We're finalizing the guest list for the wedding. You'll come, of course. I'll think about it, I said. You'll love it, she insisted. The venue's in Italy. Private island. Exclusive crowd. The governor's wife might attend. I met her eyes and smiled. So will the bill collectors. Her face froze. Caleb shot me a warning glare. My father cleared his throat. Enough. Let's not forget where you came from, Elena. Oh, I haven't, I said. I just stopped pretending it's where I belong. The piano started playing softly from the corner, Mrs. Porter, trying to ease the tension. The familiar notes of Silent Night floated through the air, fragile and haunting. My father finished his wine, his expression unreadable. You've changed, he said finally. I had to, I replied. You made sure of it, he smirked. You sound proud. I am. The clock in the hallway struck 9, its echo filling the room. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The fire hissed, the piano played, and outside snow buried the world in white. I sat back, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I could feel the storm within me quieting into something sharper, calmer. They still thought I was playing their game. They still thought I was losing. But they hadn't seen the board change yet. When I finally looked up, I caught Mrs. Porter's gaze across the room. She nodded slightly as if she knew. I gave her the smallest smile in return. They wanted to humiliate me. Instead, they reminded me exactly why I'd built an empire without them. Let them laugh tonight, I thought. Tomorrow, they'll remember who they dismissed. And by then, it'll be far too late. The letter arrived on a gray morning in late November, hand-delivered by a courier who looked too polished for the neighborhood. I was at my desk, finishing a call with a Singapore investor, when Clara poked her head in. This just came for you, she said, holding a thick cream envelope sealed in red wax. The emblem pressed into it, a crest of 2 lions, was unmistakable. Harrington, my family. For a moment, I just stared at it. I hadn't seen that seal in 6 years. My stomach tightened, not with fear, but with something heavier, memory. I dismissed Clara with a nod, waited until the office door closed, then turned the envelope in my hands. It smelled faintly of pine and wealth, the kind of scent my mother used to spray on Christmas linens. I broke the seal, carefully unfolded the heavy cardstock, and read, Family Christmas Eve, Dinner, Lakewood Estate. We'd love for you to join us. Signed, simply Father and Mother. No apology. No explanation. Just formality. I let the letter fall onto my desk. The sunlight cut across it like a spotlight, bright and cruel. 6 years of silence, of erasure, and this was their attempt at reconciliation. No, it wasn't reconciliation. It was performance. I leaned back in my chair, watching the skyline beyond the glass. The city glittered below, sharp, alive, mine. They had taken everything from me once, but they couldn't take this. Not anymore. The door opened again, and Alex stepped in, his laptop under one arm. He caught the look on my face and frowned. What's that? I didn't answer right away. He crossed the room, picked up the letter, and read it. Wow, he said finally. That's bold. Bold, I repeated, my voice dry. That's one word for it. He set it back down. You're not actually thinking about going, are you? I don't know, Elena. His tone softened. They didn't invite you because they missed you. They invited you because they need something. I know, I said quietly. But maybe I need something too. What could you possibly need from them? Closure, I said. A chance to see what's left of them when they realize I'm not their failure anymore, he exhaled. You really think that'll change anything? Not for them, I said. For me. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Then promise me something. What? When you walk in there, do it as the woman who built her own empire. Not the girl they tried to break. I smiled faintly. That's the only way I'd ever walk back through those doors. That night I took the letter home and laid it on the kitchen counter beside a glass of wine. I stared at it for so long that the wax glinted under the light like blood. My reflection in the window looked like someone else, older, stronger, harder. The kind of woman they'd never expected me to become. I thought of my father's voice that day in the boardroom. Failure builds character. He had said it like a curse. I had turned it into prophecy. The next morning, I called my mother's assistant. The voice on the line was cold and efficient. Mrs. Harrington's residence. How may I help you? This is Elena, I said. A pause, then too quickly. Of course, Mrs. Harrington will be delighted to hear from you. I doubted that. The phone clicked, and then my mother's voice came through perfectly smooth, perfectly practiced. Elena, darling, how lovely. Mother, I hope the invitation reached you. We've been talking about having the family together for ages. 6 years, I said flatly. A tiny pause. Well, better late than never. Why now? She hesitated. It's Christmas. It's family. And your father, well, he'd like to see you. To see me or to see how much I've become worth. Her tone sharpened. Don't start with that. I'm just curious what made you remember I exist. Elena, she sighed. You're being dramatic. It's one dinner. For appearances' sake, if nothing else. Appearances, I repeated. Of course. So you'll come. I looked out the window at the city skyline where the morning light was cutting across the rooftops. Yes, I said finally. I'll be there. When I hung up, I felt strangely calm. It wasn't peace, it was purpose. The following days blurred into work and routine, but beneath it all was an undercurrent of anticipation. Every decision felt deliberate, as if I were preparing for war. When the team gathered in the boardroom to finalize year-end numbers, I barely heard them. My mind was already at Lakewood, walking through memories I'd buried under ambition. On Friday afternoon, I met with my banker from Sterling Private. Mr. Collins, efficient as always, slid a report across the table. Congratulations, Miss Harrington, he said. Your accounts now total $920 million. You qualify for our Ultra Premier client tier. I almost laughed. Ultra Premier, I repeated. That sounds expensive. He smiled politely. Exclusivity always is. When the meeting ended, I sat in my car and opened my phone. The screen glowed with numbers that would have made my father's jaw tighten with envy. 920 million. The same man who had called me a disappointment now ran a company valued at half that. I wondered if he knew. I wondered if it would matter. That evening, Alex stopped by my apartment. He found me sitting on the couch with a glass of whiskey, the Lakewood invitation lying open beside me. You still thinking about it? He asked. I already said yes. He nodded slowly. Then I guess you're ready? I don't know if anyone's ever ready to go back there, I said. He sat down next to me. Maybe not. But you're not going back as their daughter. You're going back as the storm they created. I smiled at that, a small sharp curve of my lips. I'll take that. Before he left, he handed me a small box wrapped in dark green paper. Early Christmas gift, he said. Inside was a gold watch, simple, elegant, engraved with words so faint I had to tilt it toward the light. Time favors the patient. I looked up at him. Thank you. He shrugged. You waited 6 years. Seems about right. The next morning, I booked a flight to Vermont. First class, direct, no return date. On the day of my departure, Clara caught me in the hallway. Leaving already? She asked. Just for a few days, I said. Christmas business. Family business, I smiled thinly. Something like that. As I boarded the plane, snow was beginning to fall, soft flakes swirling around the runway lights. The city beneath me grew smaller, then disappeared into clouds. I pressed my forehead to the window, watching the endless white below. My father used to say that control was everything, that chaos destroyed weak people. But I had learned something he never could sometimes. You have to lose control to find power. When the plane touched down in Vermont, twilight had already fallen. The air was sharp-scented with pine and cold earth. Outside the terminal, a black car waited, driver holding a sign with my name. Miss Harrington, he said as I approached. Your family sent me. I slid into the back seat. Of course they did. The drive to Lakewood was long and winding. Snow clung to the trees, thick and glittering in the headlights. As we approached the estate, the gates came into view, iron ornate, crowned with the family crest. They swung open automatically, the motion smooth, mechanical, obedient. I couldn't help but smirk. Even the gates still recognized my name. When the mansion appeared, it was exactly as I remembered, towering windows glowing with golden light, every corner decorated to perfection. It looked like a painting frozen in time. I felt nothing. No nostalgia. No warmth. Just a quiet readiness. Mrs. Porter met me at the door, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Miss Elena," she whispered, voice trembling. "You came." I hugged her, tightly breathing in the scent of cinnamon and old wood. "Of course I did," I said. "I wouldn't miss the finale." She pulled back, studying me. "You look stronger." I had to be. Her smile softened. "Be kind, child, but not too kind." "I never am," I said. As she led me toward the grand staircase, the sound of laughter drifted from the dining room. My father's deep, commanding voice, my mother's melodic one. Caleb's careless arrogance, the same sounds that had once defined my entire world. At the top of the stairs, I paused. Below me, the chandeliers sparkled over a scene so perfectly staged it could have been from a magazine. My family, my ghosts, my past. I smoothed my dress, took a slow breath, and descended. They had no idea what was coming. And for the first time in years, neither did I. The car rolled slowly up the long drive, its headlights cutting through the snow. I sat perfectly still in the back seat, hands folded on my lap, watching the mansion emerge from the darkness like a ghost. The Harrington Estate, Lakewood, stood exactly as I remembered, grand, symmetrical, and cold. Light spilled from every window, each one glowing gold against the white of winter. From the outside it looked flawless. Inside I knew it was built on silence and pride. When the driver stopped, the front doors opened before I could reach for the handle. 2 house staff members stepped forward, their faces polite but wary. Then she appeared, Mrs. Porter. She was smaller now, her hair silver gray, but her smile was the same. "Miss Elena," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You came." I stepped out into the snow and hugged her, feeling warmth for the first time all day. "Of course I came," I said softly. "You didn't think I'd miss the annual performance, did you?" She gave a small laugh, eyes glistening. "Still sharp, I see. They're waiting in the dining hall. But be kind, child. Just not too kind." "I'll try to remember," I said, brushing snow from my coat. The grand doors swung open as we stepped inside. The scent of pine candle wax and old money filled the air. A massive Christmas tree towered in the center of the hall, strung with crystal ornaments that glittered like ice. A pianist played softly in the distance, some carol meant to sound joyful, but here felt rehearsed. Every garland, every ribbon, every candle was placed perfectly. It was beauty without warmth. My heels clicked against the marble floor as Mrs. Porter led me toward the main staircase. At the top, I paused, my hand on the banister. Below, I could see them, my family, my ghosts. My father stood near the fireplace, commanding the room with his booming laugh. My mother glided between guests, her red dress catching the light. Caleb sat close to Sophie, whispering something in her ear that made her giggle. They all looked perfect. Perfectly false. "Elena." My mother's voice carried up the stairs when she noticed me. Conversations faltered. Faces turned. I descended slowly, every step deliberate. The room quieted as I reached the final stair. My mother met me first, arms open, her smile practiced. "Darling, you made it." "Of course," I said calmly. "Wouldn't want to disappoint the audience." My father turned. For a brief second, surprise flickered in his eyes before it hardened back into control. "You look healthy," he said, the faintest edge of disapproval under the compliment. "So do you," I replied. Caleb leaned back in his chair, smirking. "On time, that's new. Traffic was light," I said smoothly. "And I didn't want to miss the show." A few of the guests chuckled awkwardly. My father's jaw tightened. My mother cleared her throat and gestured toward the table. "Come, everyone's waiting. Let's keep things festive." As we walked, Mrs. Porter caught my eye from the doorway. She gave the smallest nod, a silent reminder that I still held the upper hand, even if no one else in the room knew it. Dinner began the same way it always had, with control disguised as conversation. My father at the head, my mother orchestrating smiles, Caleb performing charm for anyone who mattered. The same hierarchy, unchanged. The same invisible chain of command. Between bites of roasted duck, my father talked loudly about the market, about strategic leadership, about real business sense. Words meant to fill the air and keep emotions at bay. I answered only when necessary, my tone light but measured. "So Elena," my mother said, finally breaking a lull in conversation. "We've all been wondering what you've been up to these past few years." "Working," I said simply. "Working, that's våge." Sophie leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "We heard something about you starting a little investment company. What's it called again, Solstice?" "Yes," I said. "Solstice Capital." She gave a brittle laugh. "Sounds ambitious." "It is," I replied. Ambition's all I had left after being fired. The words hung between us like a crack in glass. My father's fork froze mid-air. "That's enough," he said. "I was just answering the question," I said softly. Caleb snorted into his wine. "She's still dramatic." I looked at him. Still living off someone else's approval. My mother clapped her hands once too quickly. Now, let's not argue. It's Christmas, for heaven's sake." I smiled faintly. "Exactly. The season of truth." My father's voice lowered, calm but sharp. "You're a guest here, Elena. Try to act like one." I met his eyes. "Guests are invited, father." I was summoned. A tense silence followed. Then deliberately I reached for my wine and took a slow sip. Let them think they'd cornered me. Let them think I'd come here still needing their approval. That illusion was my armor. When dinner paused between courses, my mother stood guiding me toward the sitting room. "Walk with me," she said quietly. The corridor was lined with portraits, ancestors staring down in gilded frames, all stern faces and ambition. The kind of people my father adored. "I know tonight is difficult," she said. "But your father means well. He always has." "He meant control," I said. "That's not the same thing," she sighed. "You never understood him." "I understood him perfectly," I said. "I just stopped trying to please him." She turned toward me, frustration flickering beneath her polished mask. "You always had to have the last word. And you always let him have every other one," I replied. Her expression softened for just a moment. "He misses you, you know." "No," I said quietly. "He misses control of me." We stood in silence, the ticking of the grandfather clock filling the hall. Then she touched my arm. "Please don't make a scene tonight." "I won't," I said. "But I can't promise I'll let him keep pretending." Back in the dining room, laughter rose again as if nothing had happened. Caleb was telling a story about his latest business trip, exaggerating every detail while Sophie clung to his arm. My father nodded approvingly, his pride visible in every gesture. I took my seat. Mrs. Porter appeared at my side, refilling my glass. Her hand brushed mine briefly, and she whispered, "They don't see it yet." I glanced at her. "See what?" "That they're already losing." My gaze drifted back to my father. He was laughing again, loud and unrestrained, certain of his power. I smiled faintly. Then let them laugh. Outside, snow began to fall harder, blanketing the windows in white. Inside, the air felt heavier with every passing moment. When dessert was announced, my father stood to make another toast. "To family," he said, his voice booming. "To legacy and to those who carry it forward." I raised my glass too, meeting his eyes. "To the lessons we learn, especially the ones we never forget." Our eyes locked, neither of us blinking. Around us, the laughter continued, the clinking of crystal and silver filling the silence between us. But beneath it all, something had shifted. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain. As the evening drew on, I caught my reflection in the window, composed, unreadable, a stranger even to myself. I'd spent years building walls out of logic and steel. Now, standing in the house that had built my fear, I realized something simple: I wasn't afraid anymore. When the clock struck 10, Mrs. Porter appeared in the doorway again. "Dessert is ready, sir," she said to my father. Then she glanced at me and added quietly, "The table's waiting." I nodded once. The table was waiting. So was my revenge. I turned to my father and smiled politely. "Shall we?" He didn't realize it yet, but by the end of the next hour, the world he controlled would no longer belong to him. The dining room glowed under the chandelier, a soft golden haze that made everything look too perfect to be real. Crystal glasses sparkled, silver cutlery shone, and the air smelled of pine and roasted duck. It was a scene pulled straight from one of my mother's magazines, spreads beauty without warmth. The table stretched long enough to separate me from my father by several lifetimes. He sat at the head of coarse shoulders squared, like a monarch surveying his court. Around him, conversation buzzed, a symphony of shallow laughter and subtle one-upmanship. "Everyone," my mother announced, her smile wide and rigid, "thank you for joining us for another Harrington Christmas. Let's make this a night to remember." My father raised his glass. "To family," he declared, his voice carried effortlessly. "To legacy, and to the values that made us who we are." "To family," the others echoed. The sound was polite, hollow. I raised my glass last. "To lessons learned," I said quietly. My father's eyes flickered toward me. The first course was served. Across the table, Caleb was already deep in conversation with one of my father's business partners, bragging about the firm's international expansion. "We've doubled profits in the last quarter," he said. "Harrington Group remains unmatched in the market." My father smiled proudly. "As it should be. We built this name with hard work and discipline. Not shortcuts, not luck." "Not everyone has the stomach for the game," Caleb added, his tone casual but pointed. I sipped my wine, and some mistake cruelty for competition. He froze for a second, then smirked. "Still sensitive, I see." "Still insecure," I replied without raising my voice. Sophie laughed too loudly, trying to break the tension. "Oh, come on, you two. It's Christmas, not a courtroom." My father gave a sharp glance. "Let them speak." It's been a while since Elena had anything to say worth hearing. I looked at him, calm, steady. 5 years to be exact. 5 years since you quit, he said. Or should I say fled? I smiled faintly. I thought of it more as relocating. His laugh was sharp and humorless. "You always did like fancy words to dress up bad decisions." My mother intervened with her trademark diplomacy. "Let's focus on the positives. Shall we, Elena? You've been in New York all this time, haven't you, doing?" "What exactly building?" I said simply. Caleb leaned forward, his grin slick with arrogance. "Building what?" "Your ego," Sophie giggled. "Oh, I remember now. Didn't you start some kind of boutique firm? What's it called again?" "Solstice something, Solstice Capital," I said. "We manage global investment portfolios." My father chuckled. "A hobby, then." "A company," I corrected. He waved a hand. "Words. Scale is what matters." I met his gaze. "Then you'll appreciate that I understand it better than most." A tense quiet spread across the table. My mother cleared her throat. "Well, it's wonderful to see everyone succeeding in their own way." "Yes," my father said, smirking. "Some ways just happen to be more measurable than others." I set down my fork. "You mean visible?" He tilted his head, feigning confusion. "What's the difference? Visibility doesn't always equal value," I said. "Some of us learn that the hard way." He studied me for a long moment, then smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of the lips that I remembered all too well. "Tell me, Elena," he said, "do you ever regret walking away from the family business?" "Every day," I replied. He leaned back, satisfied, until I added, "Regret that I didn't do it sooner." Caleb laughed loudly, too loud. "You really came back swinging, huh? Only when provoked." My father's voice cut through the noise. "You know what I've always admired about you, Elena. You never learned how to accept your limits, and you never learned how to see beyond yours," I said. He raised his glass, pretending amusement, but his eyes were sharp with irritation. A toast, then, to knowing one's place. The laughter that followed was forced and brittle. Sophie leaned closer to Caleb. You were right, she whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. She still thinks she's one of you. I met her gaze and smiled sweetly. Careful, Sophie. Some of us don't need last names to be invited to tables like this. Her face tightened, the color rising in her cheeks. At least I earned my seat. Oh, I'm sure you did, I said. The air turned thick, electric. Even my mother's perfect composure began to crack. She gave a nervous laugh. Let's all relax, shall we? We're not in a boardroom, my father chuckled. In this family, everything is a boardroom. That was the moment I realized he couldn't stop himself. He needed dominance the way other people needed air. Every word he spoke, every gesture was an act of control. And tonight he thought he had it. He leaned toward me, voice lowering just enough to sound intimate and cruel. Tell me something, Elena. How does it feel being the poorest person in this room? For a heartbeat, the world went silent. My mother gasped softly. Caleb snorted into his wine. Sophie smirked. I didn't move. Wealth is perspective, I said. Perspective doesn't pay the bills, he shot back. Neither does arrogance, I replied. He laughed again, louder this time, forcing others to join. You always did have a way with words. Shame it didn't translate to results. I smiled. Results take time. He raised his eyebrows. Oh, I'm sure you're working very hard to make ends meet. Something like that, I said. Though I prefer working to make history. He rolled his eyes, taking another sip of wine. Still chasing dreams. Still mistaking control for power. That shut him up for a second. Mrs. Porter appeared quietly at my side, refilling glasses. Her hand lingered on mine just a moment longer than necessary, a silent reassurance. The clock in the hall struck 9. The sound cut through the room like a warning bell. My phone buzzed beside my plate. I glanced down. The screen lit up with a name that froze the air inside me. Sterling Private Bank. My father's voice broke the silence. Something wrong, bill collector calling. I picked up the phone. Excuse me, I said calmly. He scoffed. On Christmas Eve, business can wait unless you're that desperate. I smiled faintly. Desperation isn't really my brand. I pressed the phone to my ear. Miss Harrington, came the voice of Mr. Collins, precise and professional. I wanted to confirm the transfer. Your account now totals $920 million. Congratulations. The words echoed like thunder inside me, though my face remained still. Thank you, I said evenly. Merry Christmas. When I ended the call, the room was watching me. Caleb grinned. Who was that? My banker, I said. Sophie laughed. Oh, please, don't tell me you still have one of those free checking accounts. Not exactly. My father snorted. Let me guess, another side hustle. You'll learn soon enough, Elena. Playing with money isn't the same as managing it. I looked at him, my voice calm, almost tender. You're right, father. But it's far more profitable. A beat of silence. He frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, I said, smiling. Just business talk. He waved a dismissive hand. You always loved to sound mysterious, but the truth is simple. You walked away and the world walked past you. I took another sip of wine, feeling the warmth of it spread slowly. You're wrong about one thing. The world doesn't walk past people who build their own. Mrs. Porter's eyes met mine again from across the room. She understood. The moment had arrived, even if they hadn't realized it yet. My father leaned back, smirking. We'll see how long that world lasts. Oh, it's lasted, I said softly. Long enough to make this dinner interesting. The clock chimed again. Snow brushed against the window pane, muffling the world outside. He raised his glass one final time. To family, he said. I raised mine. To surprises. He frowned, slightly confused by my tone. I smiled. You'll understand soon enough. And as laughter rippled weakly around the table, my phone buzzed again, another message from Sterling Private Bank. Transfer confirmed. Merry Christmas, Miss Harrington. I placed the phone face down beside my plate and looked across the glittering table at the family that once called me worthless. They thought I'd come here to beg. They didn't know I'd come to end it. The silence after my words felt heavier than the snow falling outside. My father's laughter had died somewhere between disbelief and irritation, and now only the faint clinking of cutlery filled the room. Across the table, Caleb shifted in his chair, glancing between us with the restless look of a man who senses danger but doesn't yet know where it's coming from. "Interesting tone, Elena," my father said finally, his voice too smooth. "Care to elaborate on that little?" Surprised, I took my time finishing the last sip of my wine before setting the glass down gently. "Not really. You wouldn't appreciate the numbers." Sophie giggled nervously. "Oh, I love numbers. Come on. Tell us, what kind of surprise could you possibly mean?" I smiled. "A financial one." My father leaned forward, amusement returning to his face. "Oh, I see. You've finally paid off your student loans." The table erupted in polite laughter, forced and brittle. I didn't join in. Instead, I turned to Mrs. Porter, who stood quietly at the corner of the room, her hands clasped behind her back. "Maria," I said, "would you mind bringing my phone charger from the study? I believe we'll need some proof for our dear guests tonight." She blinked, startled, but nodded quickly. "Of course, Miss Elena." As she left, Caleb chuckled. "What's this presentation? Don't tell me you've come to pitch us on one of your pet projects." "Not a pitch," I said softly. "Just a reality check." My father leaned back in his chair, clearly entertained. "Well, you've certainly learned how to dramatize a moment. Let's hear it then. What great achievement are we celebrating?" I met his eyes. "You called me the poorest in the family, father." "I thought I should correct the record." His grin faltered slightly. "Is that so?" "Yes." The door creaked open again as Mrs. Porter returned with my phone and charger. She handed it to me discreetly, her eyes flicking to my father and back. I unlocked the screen, scrolled once, and turned the display so the table could see the email that had arrived minutes earlier. "Sterling private bank account confirmation, total assets $920, 00000." The room froze. Sophie's glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, wine spilling across the white linen like a dark wound. Caleb muttered something under his breath. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. And my father simply stared. "That's not possible," he said finally. I tilted my head. "You're right. It's not possible for you. Where did you?" How he stopped, catching himself before the question could sound like weakness. "This is some kind of trick." I turned the phone toward him again. "Would you like to call my banker? He's very polite." He didn't reach for it. Caleb tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. "You expect us to believe you're worth almost $1 billion. I don't expect anything," I said calmly. "I'm simply correcting an assumption." Sophie's voice was a whisper. You really have that much?" I met her eyes. "Apparently enough to make you drop your glass." My mother spoke next, her tone trembling between disbelief and pride. "Elena, why didn't you tell us? Would it have made a difference?" I asked. "Would you have spoken to me differently? Treated me like more than an embarrassment?" She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. My father recovered enough to lean forward again, his eyes sharp with calculation now, instead of mockery. "If this is true, then perhaps you've learned something after all. You see, success does run in the family." I laughed softly. "You think this came from you?" "I gave you the tools," he said firmly. "The drive." "No," I said. "You gave me the hunger. The rest I built while you were too busy laughing." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the marble. "Watch your tone." "Or what?" I asked, rising too. "You'll fire me again." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Caleb stood too, trying to diffuse the tension. "All right, let's all calm down. This is ridiculous." "Sit down," my father snapped. "This is between us." Caleb hesitated, then obeyed. I took a slow breath, my voice quiet but steady. "5 years ago, you called me a failure in front of your board. You told me I wasn't fit for leadership, that I was weak. And maybe you were right then. But I've built something real, something that can't be taken from me. You can't shame me anymore, father. You can't define me." His nostrils flared. "Don't speak to me like that in my house." I smiled faintly. "Your house." I turned my phone back toward the screen, opening another document. "Actually, it isn't anymore." He frowned. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Check the property registry," I said. "I bought the Lakewood mortgage 3 months ago, through a holding company." For a moment he didn't understand. Then the color drained from his face. Yes," I said. "I own it now. Every inch of marble, every chandelier, even the family crest over the fireplace. It's all under my name." My mother gasped, her hand trembling. "Elena," I turned to her, my tone softening just slightly. "You told me once that home is where respect lives. You were right." Caleb pushed back from the table, shaking his head. "You can't do that. You can't just buy." "I can," I said. And I did. My father slammed his palm against the table, sending silverware clattering. "Enough of this nonsense." I met his anger with silence, letting him fill the space with noise. When he finally stopped chest heaving, I said quietly, "You taught me control was everything, but control isn't power, Father. Freedom is." He stared at me, speechless. The door creaked again, Mrs. Porter hovering nervously at the threshold. "Mr. Harrington," she said softly, "there's a call for you from the bank. They're asking to confirm a change in ownership regarding the estate deed." His head snapped toward her. "What?" Her eyes darted to me. I think it's true, sir." The last bit of color vanished from his face. He sank back into his chair as if the strength had been pulled from him. My mother reached for his hand, but he didn't take it. Caleb sat frozen, staring at me like I was something he'd never seen before. Sophie was silent, her lipstick smeared on the rim of her glass. I looked around the table, the empire of appearances collapsing in perfect silence. "Merry Christmas," I said softly. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "Elena, please." I shook my head. "You don't have to say anything. Just remember this moment the next time you think someone's worth ends where their money begins." I turned to leave, but my father's voice stopped me. "You think this makes you better than us?" I faced him one last time. "No," I said. "It makes me free." The words seemed to echo through the hall long after I'd spoken them. As I walked toward the door, Mrs. Porter followed quietly, tears glimmering in her eyes. "You did what you had to," she whispered. I nodded. It wasn't revenge, Maria. It was truth. Outside, the night air bit against my skin, clean and sharp. Snowflakes drifted down in slow spirals, melting on my coat. I paused on the porch, looking back through the window. Inside, my family sat motionless, a tableau of disbelief and pride, shattered in one stroke. I took a long breath, exhaling clouds into the cold. My phone buzzed again. A new message from Mr. Collins, transfer verified. "Congratulations, Miss Harrington. Estate registration complete." I smiled. "Merry Christmas to you too," I murmured, sliding the phone into my clutch. The snow crunched beneath my heels as I walked toward the waiting car. Behind me, the house stood quiet, the lights still glowing warm against the dark, like a lie that refused to admit it had been exposed. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was leaving home. I felt like I was finally walking into it. The morning light crept through the curtains of my hotel suite, pale and cold. Aspen had gone quiet after the storm, the mountains wrapped in white and silence. I sat at the window with a cup of black coffee, watching the snow drift lazily across the empty street below. For the first time in years, I felt nothing pressing against my chest. No anger, no fear, just stillness. The phone on the desk buzzed, breaking the calm. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. "Elena," the voice said. It was my mother. "Good morning," I replied, my tone even. "Are you still in town?" she asked softly. "Your father, he's not himself today." I let out a breath. "I imagine not. He didn't sleep," she continued. "He stayed in his study all night. He won't speak to anyone, not even Caleb. I think you should come by." I hesitated. "Why?" "Because I think it's time," she said simply. There was something in her voice, fragile, tired, almost human. "All right," I said. I'll come at noon. When I hung up, I sat in silence again, staring at my reflection in the window. My own face looked unfamiliar, stronger, older. I'd dreamed of this day for so long, of the moment they would see me for who I really was. But now that it had happened, all I felt was a strange kind of peace, the quiet that follows after a storm has already done its work. By noon, the sky had cleared. The road to Lakewood shimmered under a thin glaze of ice. The house looked different when I arrived, smaller, somehow humbled by the snow. Mrs. Porter met me at the door, her eyes red but warm. "Miss Elena," she whispered, "it's good to see you again." "You too," I said softly. "How is he in his study?" "Your mother's waiting in the conservatory." The conservatory smelled like citrus and pine. My mother sat by the window, wrapped in a cream-colored shawl. The sun made her look delicate, almost translucent. When she saw me, her eyes filled with something between relief and guilt. "You came," she said. "You asked?" She gestured toward the seat across from her. "Coffee, please." For a while we just sat there, the clinking of porcelain filling the silence. Then she spoke. "I read about your company this morning. Forbes, Bloomberg, even the Times. They're all talking about you." I smiled faintly. "I imagine Father isn't thrilled about that." Her lips curved into something like a sad smile. "He's processing. Is that what we call it now?" She sighed. "You're still sharp. Survival required it." She looked down at her cup, her voice trembling. "We didn't know how to love you properly, Elena. Your father and we thought we were teaching you strength, but we were really teaching you fear." The words caught me off guard. My mother was not a woman who apologized, not for anything. "Why are you saying this now?" "Because it's true," she said. "And because I don't want to leave this life with lies still sitting on my tongue." I stared at her for a long moment. The anger I'd expected to feel wasn't there. Just understanding. "You could have stopped him," I said quietly. She nodded. "I tried, but your father doesn't listen when he's afraid. And you always frightened him, Elena." "Why? Because you saw through him. Because you didn't need him." The words landed heavier than I expected. We sat in silence for another moment before Mrs. Porter appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Harrington asked to see Miss Elena," she said. My mother squeezed my hand. "You don't have to." "I know," I said, standing. "But I will." The walk to his study felt longer than it used to. The same hallway, the same photographs on the wall, family portraits of people who'd once looked untouchable. Now they seemed like ghosts, remnants of a world that had already fallen apart. When I reached the door, it was half open. My father sat behind the desk, the same one where he'd fired me 5 years ago. He looked smaller now, the edges of his confidence worn away. His tie was loose, his hands clasped in front of him. He didn't look up. "Come to gloat?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "No," I said. "I came to finish what we started." He gave a hollow laugh. "You destroyed everything I built." I stepped closer. "No, I rebuilt what you broke." He finally looked at me then. His eyes were bloodshot, but behind the exhaustion, I saw something else: shame. "You sound like me," he said. "I sound like the version of you that could have been." He exhaled long and slow. "You think I was cruel." Maybe I was. But I was trying to protect this family. From what I asked? From failure. From disappointment. You taught us to measure love and success, Father. And when I didn't fit your definition, you erased me. He stared at his hands. "And now, you have it all. The money, the power. Are you happy?" I hesitated. "I'm free." He gave a dry laugh. "Freedom's just another illusion, Elena. You'll learn that." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the desk. "No, Father. The illusion was thinking I needed your approval to have peace." For a long time, he said nothing. Then quietly, "You always had your mother's way with words." "She found hers," I said. "Maybe it's your turn." His gaze dropped to the drawer beside him. Slowly, he opened it and pulled out an envelope. "I wrote this the night you left," he said. "Never sent it. Didn't have the courage. I didn't move." He slid it across the desk. The envelope was old edges worn my name, written in the familiar precise script of a man who couldn't stand mistakes. I picked it up. Why give it to me now? Because I don't know how much time I have left to make things right. The words caught me off guard. Are you sick? He gave a tired smile. Just human. I tucked the envelope into my coat. I'll read it later. He nodded. Fair enough. Then after a pause, you could save the company you know. With what you have, you could fix what's left of it. I could, I said. But you won't. I shook my head. Not for you. He looked down again, his voice breaking. Then at least save the people. They don't deserve to lose their jobs because of me. That made me stop. I thought of the hundreds of employees who'd spent their lives building his empire who now faced ruin because of his pride. I'll think about it, I said finally. He nodded slowly. That's all I can ask. When I turned to leave, his voice stopped me. Elena, he said. I looked back. I was wrong, he said quietly. About everything. I didn't answer. I just met his eyes and gave a small nod before walking away. Back in the conservatory, my mother stood waiting. How did it go? Better than I expected, I said. She smiled faintly. He needed to hear you, even if he won't admit it. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky was the color of glass, pale and endless. As I stepped out onto the porch, the air bit at my cheeks, but I didn't mind. For the first time in years, the cold didn't feel like punishment. It felt clean. At the car, I paused, glancing back at the house one last time. The windows glowed softly against the white. Inside, I could see shadows moving. My mother. My father, maybe even the remnants of the people we used to be. I took a long breath, exhaled and whispered to the wind. We're done now. When I slid into the car, I didn't look back again. As the driver pulled away, my phone buzzed. A message from Clara back in New York. Transfer complete. The acquisition is officially under Solstice ownership. Congratulations, Miss Harrington. I smiled to myself. Not congratulations, I murmured. Closure. Outside, the road wound down through the mountains, each turn taking me further from the house, from the weight of the past. I didn't know what awaited me in New York. More headlines, more meetings, maybe another empire to rebuild, but for now it didn't matter. For now all I wanted was the silence of snow, the sound of my own heart steady and sure, and the knowledge that for the first time in my life I was finally free. New York was still half asleep when the call came through. Clara's voice trembled slightly on the other end of the line, a mix of nerves and exhilaration. It's done, Elena. The papers are signed. Solstice now owns 100% of Harrington Group. For a moment I didn't answer. I stood by the window of my penthouse, coffee cooling in my hand, watching the skyline wake beneath a pale gray dawn. The city looked eternal, cold, glittering alive. Below, cars moved like veins of light through the streets. My reflection in the glass was calm, almost serene. Send the release, I said, finally. But keep it simple, no celebration. Clara hesitated. Do you want a public announcement? I shook my head, though she couldn't see me. No headlines. Just a statement, ownership transfer complete. That's all. There was a pause. You don't want them to know. They already know, I said quietly. Last night made sure of it. When the call ended, I turned back to the window. I had imagined this moment for years, the moment I'd take back everything that was taken from me. But it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like restoration, quiet and complete. By mid-morning, I was at Solstice headquarters. The glass doors opened to the lobby where employees moved briskly, their energy charged with the momentum of something new. I caught fragments of conversation. She did it. It's official. My heels echoed on the marble floor as I made my way to the boardroom. Inside, the senior executives from both companies waited tense and uncertain. The men who once sat under my father's command now stood when I entered. One of them, a man named Wexler, cleared his throat nervously. Miss Harrington. Elena, I corrected. Titles don't matter here anymore. He nodded quickly. Of course. Congratulations, ma'am. I smiled faintly. This isn't about congratulations. It's about correction. The room fell silent. I walked to the head of the table, the same seat my father used to occupy, and placed my hands on the polished surface. Let's start with the truth, I said. Harrington Group failed because it forgot what integrity looked like. It became about control, not vision. That ends today. A few exchanged uncertain glances. Someone near the back murmured, "What does that mean for us?" "It means," I said, "we rebuild not as a family empire but as something real. We'll restructure, rebrand, and redirect 20% of operations to community investment, small businesses, women-led startups, renewable energy." There was a stunned silence. Then Wexler spoke again, his tone cautious. "That's ambitious." I smiled. "Good. If it doesn't scare you, it isn't worth doing." The words hung in the air like oxygen, reviving something that had long suffocated under greed. For the first time, I saw hope reflected in their eyes instead of fear. When the meeting ended, I stayed behind alone in the quiet room. I sat in my father's old chair and ran my fingers along the armrest. The same wood that once felt like judgment now felt like closure. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the morning's news. The headline was already spreading: Solstice acquires Harrington Group in historic private buyout. Beneath it, a sub-headline: Former Harris reclaims family empire. I almost laughed. If only they knew it wasn't about reclaiming. It was about releasing. That afternoon, Clara brought me the finalized ownership documents to sign. When she handed them to me, her smile was radiant. "You did it. We did it," I corrected. Her expression softened. "Your father's name still carries weight, you know. The markets are calling this a redemption story." "Redemption," I said thoughtfully. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just balance." After she left, I lingered at the window again. Outside, the city pulsed with energy, ambition, chaos, creation. I thought of my father sitting alone in his study, the weight of loss pressing down on him. Once I would have wanted him to suffer for what he'd done. Now I just wanted him to understand. By late evening, I called him. The line rang longer than expected before he finally picked up. "Elena," he said, his voice quiet, almost uncertain. "Hello, Dad." "I wondered when you'd call," he said. "I wasn't sure I would." A pause. Then he asked, "You got what you wanted?" "No," I said softly. "I got what I needed." He gave a low laugh, more weary than bitter. "And what's that piece?" Another pause. "I suppose you've earned it." "I didn't earn it," I said. "I built it." "There's a difference," he sighed. "You sound just like your mother. I'll take that as a compliment." There was a rustling sound on his end, the faint clink of a glass being set down. "You've taken over the company. The board's talking about new leadership. I assume you'll be CEO for now," I said. "But that's not the goal." "Oh, what is?" "To make sure what happened to me never happens to anyone else under our name." He was silent. Then quietly, "You really believe you can change what I built?" "I don't need to," I said. "I just need to fix what you broke." He let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "You've grown colder than I ever was." "No," I said, "just clearer." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of the city filled the silence between us. Then, unexpectedly, he said, "I'm proud of you." The words caught me off guard. I almost didn't believe them. "You've never said that before." "I should have," he admitted. "I was wrong about you." I didn't reply right away. My throat tightened slightly. "Maybe we were both wrong," I said. He hesitated. "So what happens now?" "Now," I said quietly, "we start over. Not as father and daughter, not as enemies. Just as two people who finally see each other clearly." He exhaled slowly. "I'd like that." The call ended there, not with an apology, not with tears, just silence. But for the first time, that silence didn't feel empty. It felt like understanding. Later that night, as I sat at my desk signing the final documents, I looked down at the company's seal beside my signature: Harrington Group reformed by Solstice. The irony was perfect. The name that once chained me now lived under my terms. I switched off the lights and left the office, taking the elevator down to the street. The winter air hit me as soon as the doors opened, sharp, clean, and alive. Across the avenue, the city stretched wide beneath the glow of streetlights and snow. As I walked toward the car, Clara's message appeared on my phone. The press wants to know if you'll do an interview about the acquisition. A daughter's redemption is trending. I smiled faintly and typed back, "Redemption isn't the point. Evolution is." Then I put the phone away. That night in my apartment, I poured myself a single glass of wine and stood by the window again. The skyline glittered like scattered diamonds. I thought of my mother's trembling hands around her coffee cup, my father's hollow eyes when he said he was proud, and the girl I used to be, the one who'd sat on a park bench years ago crying in the snow after losing everything. She was gone now, but she hadn't disappeared. She'd simply evolved into the woman standing here, calm and unshakable, her reflection framed by the city that once ignored her. I raised my glass slightly toward the skyline. "To freedom," I whispered. The city didn't answer, but it didn't need to. Its lights flickered in silent acknowledgement like stars against the steel of night. Tomorrow would bring headlines, meetings, questions, admiration, envy. But tonight was just for me, for the quiet victory that didn't need applause. The kind of victory that only peace can give. The city was still half asleep when I woke, its skyline washed in pale gold light that bled slowly through the glass. For a long time I didn't move. The hum of Manhattan below felt distant, like a heartbeat I could finally rest beside instead of racing against. My coffee steamed on the table beside me, untouched. I stood by the window, my reflection layered over the rising sun, and I realized that for the first time in my life I wasn't running from anything. Not my past, not their judgment, not even myself. The phone buzzed softly. A notification from Forbes legacy leaders, Elena Harrington, the woman who rebuilt her family's empire. I smiled faintly, not out of pride but recognition. For years, legacy had been the word that caged me. Now it was something I'd remade with my own hands. By noon, I was standing on the stage at Solstice headquarters, the lights warm on my face. Rows of people, employees, journalists, former rivals, filled the atrium. Behind me, the new logo glowed on the screen, the Harrington Foundation. I glanced at Clara, who gave me a reassuring nod. "Good afternoon," I began. 5 years ago, I lost everything I thought defined me: my job, my family, my sense of belonging. But what I didn't lose was the ability to start again. A hush fell over the room. "Power," I continued, "is not control. It's the ability to build without fear." A ripple of applause moved through the crowd, soft at first, then louder. Cameras flashed. I went on. "This foundation exists for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong at the table, for those underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed. Because sometimes being excluded is the greatest gift. It forces you to create your own space." Near the back, I saw Zoe, the young woman I'd once mentored, watching with bright eyes. She was now the foundation's director. That alone made every sleepless night worth it. When the ceremony ended, people surrounded me, handshakes, photographs, congratulations. But the best moment came quietly when a girl no older than 20 approached me with trembling hands and said, "Your story made me believe I can start over too." I smiled at her. Then everything I went through was worth it. A month later, the winter softened. I drove upstate to my parents' home, no longer the fortress of pride it once was. The gates stood open and the house looked smaller against the snow, humble human. My father met me at the door wearing an apron dusted with flour. "I made the roast," he said awkwardly. "Don't laugh." "I wouldn't dare," I replied, smiling. My mother's hug was long and trembling. "It's good to have you home," she whispered. At dinner, the air was different. No tension, no hierarchy. Just the gentle rhythm of family finding its way back. Caleb and his wife Leah joined us too, laughter echoing where silence used to live. We talked about work, travel, the future. When dessert came, my father lifted his glass. To Elena, he said softly, "For saving what I destroyed." I shook my head. To all of us, I said, "For finally learning what matters." For the first time, he smiled, not the sharp, commanding grin I remembered, but something fragile and real. You gave this family a second chance, he murmured. Maybe we gave it to ourselves, I replied. After dinner, I stepped outside into the cold. Snowflakes drifted from the sky, catching the light from the windows. I could see my family inside, talking, laughing, alive. The same people who once broke me were now rebuilding in their own way. It didn't erase the past, but it softened it. I stood by the frozen garden when my father joined me. He didn't speak right away. We just looked up at the stars bright against the night. You've done more with this name than I ever did, he said finally. You built an empire, I said. I just gave it a soul, he nodded slowly. Maybe that was always supposed to be your lesson. He turned back toward the house, but before he stepped inside, he added, I'm proud of you. The words settled quietly in the cold air, and I let them stay there, simple, unadorned enough. Later, as I drove back to the city, I thought about how strange it was that closure doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with peace, with silence, with knowing that you've lived long enough to see yourself whole again. When I returned home, the city was glowing. The office building across the street had the foundation's new banner displayed, empowering tomorrow today. It made me laugh, a little too polished, too corporate, but still true. In my apartment, I poured a glass of wine and set up the camera by the window. Clara had suggested I record a message for Solstice's social channels. Something personal, she'd said. Something from you. The red light blinked on. I leaned back in the chair, the city lights framing me, and began. If you've been following my story, I said, my voice steady, you know it wasn't built on perfection. It was built on failure, heartbreak, and more than a few long nights of wondering if I'd made the worst mistake of my life. I paused, exhaling softly. But here's what I learned: being underestimated isn't a curse. It's freedom. When no one expects anything from you, you get to build quietly without permission. You get to rise without applause. And when you finally do, the world can't take it away because it never gave it to you. I smiled faintly. Revenge might feel powerful, but forgiveness is the real strength. Revenge gives you control. Forgiveness gives you peace, and peace lasts. The light from the window caught the rim of my glass, scattering tiny fragments of gold across the table. If this story reminds you of your own fight, I said softly, tell me. Leave your story below. Someone might need to hear it tonight. Maybe someone like I once was, sitting alone, wondering if they'll ever get up again. I glanced at the skyline behind me. Thank you for listening, I said. Stay with me. There are more stories to tell about redemption, justice, and finding yourself when the world tells you you're lost. I reached forward and turned off the camera. The city hummed quietly beneath me, the heartbeat of a place that never sleeps. For a moment I stood there, watching my own reflection fade into the lights beyond the glass. And with a quiet smile, I whispered to no one in particular, your legacy doesn't begin when you win. It begins the moment you choose peace over pride. Outside, the snow fell softly over New York, clean, unhurried, endless. If you're still here listening, maybe it's because a part of this story belongs to you too. So tell me where you're watching from, what you've survived, and what you're building next. Because every story of resilience deserves to be heard. And if you're ready for more, stay. There's another story waiting just beyond this one.